Welcome to a special episode of Manhattan Insights, a Manhattan Institute production. I am Yael Hungerford, Executive Director of the Adam Smith Society at the Manhattan Institute, and it's my pleasure to share our recent discussion with Abigail Shrier on her new book, Bad Therapy: Why the Kids Aren't Growing Up. Abigail Shrier has long been raising the alarm on troubling new trends involving the development of our children. Her book, Irreversible Damage, warns of the siren call of transgender ideology among teenage girls. This new book, Bad Therapy, an investigation into the mental health industry, promises to be equally important for all who care about the next generation. Abigail Shrier received the Barbara Olson Award for Excellence and Independence in Journalism in 2021. Her best-selling book, Irreversible Damage, The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters, was named a best book by The Economist and The Times of London. She has written for the Manhattan Institute City Journal for a number of years. Our moderator, Emily Yoffe, is a senior editor at the Free Press. Prior to that, she was a contributing writer at The Atlantic, where she focused on campus sexual assault, Me Too, and the need for due process. We hope you enjoy this conversation.
Describe the problem that you write about in Bad Therapy. What is it? How we got here, and maybe how we can get out. So what was the spark that started this book? And tell us a couple of the most surprising things you discovered.
Sure. It's great to be here. I'm crazy about City Journal and the Manhattan Institute. It's always a joy to write for them, and of course to be here with one of my absolute heroes, Emily Yoffe, is just a great honor. So thank you. So look, they always sort of parody these things in the press, but the book in some ways is not very surprising, right? The book says that anything that is powerful, any intervention that is powerful, that is efficacious, can help. It can also necessarily harm, right? That's true of any intervention. Now, how did I get to, so that's the claim about the therapeutic interventions our kids are getting. How did I get here? So with the last book, I took a look at, one phenomenon going on in the mental health of teen girls, obviously, why they were all girls in distress were deciding they were transgender. I'm raising 3 kids in this generation. So I'm concerned about how they turn out. And I'm not just concerned as an academic, I'm concerned because I want to, get it right, if there is such a thing. I don't want them to end up like sort of the kids, some of the kids you see around who are in terrible distress, who, can't seem to function, who need mental health days off of work. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't people who are in profound distress and there's nothing look, they need all the help we can give them. And frankly, they're not getting enough, right? So there are the bipolar patients, there are the schizophrenics. My book's not about that. What I'm looking at is why the average kid in America, part of Gen Z, might say when driving past their middle school, oh, I can't drive past that, I have PTSD. So I'm not minimizing PTSD. It's kind of the opposite. I think PTSD is a really severe, serious thing. And I don't think if you were picked on in middle school, you have it, generally speaking. But how what I wanted to know was, I started out with a question, which is how I should have answered. I started out with a question. Why were the kids who'd had the most mental health intervention, the most therapy, the most psychiatric meds, the most social emotional learning, the most coping skills, the most mindfulness, they should have been the picture of mental health. So why were they in so much distress? See, I started by taking seriously the idea that their pain was real. I would never call them snowflakes. That's not, sort of my orientation toward the rising generation. I don't think that they are. I think their distress is absolutely real. And I was very concerned to know, how did they end up in such distress? Because it wasn't obvious from the outside. And the second thing I wondered was, why did they seem to have no interest in growing up? Why didn't they rush to get their driver's licenses? Why, I just read, are 56% of 18 to 25-year-olds living with their parents and the lowest unemployment we've seen, right? These are very, very low unemployment numbers. They're living at home, it seems, because they want to, or they're at least content to, with their parents. These were things we would have packed ourselves 8 to an apartment to avoid when I was young. And I think it matters. That's the thing. I think it matters because sort of the underlying thesis of the book is that growing up is actually the cure for adolescent angst. And if they're trapped in this feeling of incapacity, they're trapped in this feeling of distress, and they don't feel up to growing up, they may never get out of that.
You open the book with a banger of an anecdote about your 12-year-old son coming home from camp, I think, with a stomach ache that won't clear up. So, well, let's go see the pediatrician. And what happens next kind of helps explain the thesis of your book and what you just described. So you're there, what happens? Tell us.
Sure. So it's funny. I had already written the book pretty much, and I showed up at urgent care last summer with my son, who was in terrible stomach ache, and it was a Sunday, so our pediatrician was closed, so I went to our local urgent care just to make sure it wasn't appendicitis, because it lasted a while. And so they said, nope. They did a little quick test on him. They said, no, it's not, it's fine. It'll probably either be, I thought maybe he had a weird bug. Anyway, they sent us home, but they said, before you go, it's just dehydration, have him drink. But before you go, we'd like to do our mental health screener, so we're going to ask you to leave. And I had already written this book, and yet I stood up to leave. And then I thought, why am I leaving? Hold on. And I sat back down, and I said, could I please see your mental health screener? And the man looked shocked because most parents don't ask to see it. By the way, I almost didn't, right? It was 5 questions, and they are a series of escalating questions that turned out to be issued by the National Institute of Mental Health. This is a federal government agency. This was the standard form for kids 8 and up. And there's a series of escalating questions about whether and why a kid might want to kill himself. And by the way, asking parents to leave the room is part of the protocol on the website, right on the website, National Institute of Mental Health Division of NIH, or it's affiliated with NIH and so on. So it was just one more instance when I realized a few things, or I was reminded a few things.
Well, one of the questions was, wasn't it, have you felt like killing yourself today?
Right. Do you think your parents might be better off without you? Now, remember, my son wasn't there for a suicidal ideation. He was there for a stomach ache. And also these questions were so bizarre that anyone would put them in front of a kid, right? They so flew in the face of anything we would think was good for kids. Now, it turns out a lot of psychologists, when I would interview them, say, no, we know that asking about suicide doesn't encourage propensity for suicide. Okay. But these kids are getting deluged, I learned, with suicide questions in a way that we haven't seen before.
Well, it's like a push-pull for suicide. I'm surprised that psychologists told you that, because most of the literature I'm aware of about suicide is be very careful in talking about it, especially to young people, because there is a kind of virality in it, and normalizing it as a response to life's distress is very dangerous.
That's exactly right. So suicide can be contagious, and there are 3 things that they have found that that researchers have found increase. There's really great studies on this. Increase the contagion or the chance of spreading it, and that is valorizing the subject, presenting it as a means of coping, and the third is repetitive mention. Okay. So even researchers, when I asked about this, very often would tell me, well, a simple survey won't do that. Maybe that's right. I mean, I believe that. And they measured it 2 days later. I think the period was very shortly after. That won't make a kid want to kill himself. Okay. But then what I had learned from the investigation and going into the schools, getting the documents on the quantity of these surveys, these surveys kids were getting across the country, was that kids were being asked about this in a repetitive manner. They were presenting this as normalized. They were explaining it very often to the kids in the surveys as a means of coping. They were doing a lot of the things that actually the research showed was the opposite of what would be the sensible or responsible thing to do. And these are, by the way, these surveys are very often written by the CDC that are, statewide. Across the country. They're in all kinds of states, every state that I've found. So, and that's sort of a theme of the book, that the psychological literature is actually pretty clear on things, the iatrogenic harms of therapeutic intervention. There are a series of known, tested harms that therapy can cause. We have all sorts of research on this. And what the practitioners are doing is flying in the face of it. Now, not every practitioner, but a lot of them, especially with kids and teens.
What do you think is going on here? I mean, Jonathan Haidt, who's cited in the book as a sociologist, he has a book coming out about mental health distress. His thesis is the smartphone in 2012 getting put in the hands of children is the key moment in the decline of kids' mental health. But do you have a timeline? I know you think the smartphone is part of it, but what you're describing, I'm sure, is shocking to a lot of people. My daughter's 28. The idea that as an 8-year-old she'd be asked these kinds of questions is appalling to me. What happened? How did this sweep across the country and enter schools and become this bad therapy become standard fare?
I completely agree with, the idea that social media is very, very bad for kids, and absolutely was a major vector in the decline of adolescent mental health. There's no question in my mind that's true. And my last book was about a particular contagion, the idea of a trans identity and gender dysphoria being spread largely through social media. But things in a society aren't usually, single vector and single factor. And I think this is another instance where there were many things at play. And I'll give you an example. If I went back to my last book, it's true that social media played a huge role in convincing lots of teen girls that they were transgender. And it's also true that in almost every case of an adolescent girl I talked to, or parents I talked to, they had a therapist who played a big part in their revelation. And here was the interesting thing. It was almost never a gender therapist, because anxious teens weren't taken straight to the gender therapist. They were taken the moment they had a little anxiety or a sadness in middle school. They were taken to a psychodynamic psychotherapist who sat with them weekly and explored what might be causing their distress. And they would explore many things, like mom, like all sorts of things, like, trauma. And one of the things the therapist would explore with them was gender. And that sort of stayed in the back of my head the whole time. Was that, they were playing a role, and here was the strange thing about it. In not a single instance did a parent say to me, and by the end I probably talked to 1,000 parents. In not a single instance did a parent say to me, I took her to a therapist, and the therapist said, you're not transgender, okay? Middle school's hard. So I just think there's it's a multivariant thing. I think there are a lot of things going on.
So you describe a lot of phenomena in this book, which I've read. It's fabulous. Everyone read it. You list 10 ways to bad therapy. So I don't want to go through all 10, but let's talk about a few of them. And these are all things that our kids are being taught by everyone from teachers to school counselors to therapists. One is pay close attention to your feelings. let them guide you. As you say, that's a wonderful way to create bullies and narcissists. So say why being in touch with your feelings is such bad advice.
Well, it turns out that if you really are honest about it and straightforward, the answer most of your day isn't exactly happy, right? You're often feeling some minor distress of some kind or another that we also suppress all day long. There's irritation, there's worry, right? There's an itch, there's a little bit of allergy. There's all kinds of things that are on our minds in a given day. And if we are constantly asked about them, we're very, very likely to produce a raft of primarily negative responses, especially if you're a kid, because you're going to be really straightforward as if you're a kid. See, adults, we know we're also always supposed to say great when we're asked how we're doing, great, but especially in America. But if you think about it, just being asked, how are you feeling? And this was brought to my mind by a wonderful psychiatrist in Germany. He's a professor of psychiatry, Michael Linden, who said to me, he said, how are you feeling right now? And I said, great. And he said, no, you're not. I can see you're concentrating on this interview. And he was right. I was actually exhausted. I had to wake up at 5 a.m. to do the interview because I was in LA and he was in Germany. I hated how I looked on the webcam, right? I hadn't put on makeup. I looked terrible. He's relaxed and happy because we did it on his schedule in Germany. And if being made to think about how I was feeling was enough to produce negative responses. So that our constant doing that with kids, tending to their feelings, worrying about their feelings, telling them to self-monitor and pay attention to their feelings. It sounds so compassionate. It really does. But I think it often, if you think about it, produces a negative reaction, right? Because actually, if you thought about it, most of life, getting through a day, involves a certain amount of repression, right? Being a good friend, being a good spouse, getting work done. It means I'm not going to attend to all my worries, all my fears, all my misgivings. I'm just going to keep going. That's actually how we live. And that's how we want our kids to live to some degree too, which doesn't mean, of course, never share your feelings. Of course not. But it also means finish your math test, then we'll talk about it.
Another one is you described the work of Peter Gray at Boston College, who's
wonderful.
The great scholar of play.
Yeah.
And he writes despairingly about the transformation of play in America. And you write about how that you think is a key to our problems here. You say that all kids need the 3 Ds: danger, discovery, and dirt. Can you talk a little bit about what's happened to play and the 3 Ds?
Sure. Well, he's done wonderful. He's wonderful. I remember reading his textbook in college, which is fantastic. He has this introductory psychology textbook, which is just a great read, believe it or not. So I was excited to get in touch with him. And he did this wonderful work showing that play has completely changed. Why? Because we monitor it. We surveil it. We stop all the risk and all the danger. And it turns out what happens when you never let a kid test their limits, they don't know what their limits are. And they become afraid of all things that aren't actually scary because they've never learned to navigate them. But there's something else too, which is that real play of the evolutionary beneficial sort, which involves some risk and some danger, the kind mom doesn't want to hear about, that stuff actually, and he's done studies on this, produces short-term joy and long-term contentment. That kind of discovery and feeling of capacity, I can climb to the top of those monkey bars, I did it. It's very hard to do today with your mom, or a nanny, or the recess monitor nervously telling you to come down. But actually, it gets a kid to test what he can do and feel good about that. And we're sort of robbing kids of that.
The last one I want to talk about is what you call drugum, the rise of psychotropic medication for children. You say changing the brain chemistry of your child is one of the most profound things you can do. And once kids get on these medicines, they could possibly be on for decades, for life. And they're put on after a cursory analysis. The parents sign off. Say more about that. And why aren't more parents saying no?
So, I talk about the ways childhood has changed, and one of the big ones is parental authority. In the last generation, parents were afraid, I think because they were afraid of inflicting trauma, emotional trauma. They were afraid of asserting their own authority. These are my rules, and you have to live by them. Which doesn't mean being cruel, it doesn't mean being unloving, it just means we have rules. And the problem is when you don't lay down rules for a kid, not only do they end up less happy, more anxious, less depressed, they also can't be trusted, right? When they have rules, you eventually learn, they understand your values, and you send them into the world. They know the rules, and you can trust them. But if you never lay down rules, you're always sort of hovering. And I think that then the question is, you're always hovering, and also they're very dysregulated. They often act out. Well, if you're afraid to punish, you're afraid to lay down rules because you've studied gentle parenting and you've heard that can traumatize a child. You lay down rules. If you lay down rules, that's what they tell you. Well, guess what? You still need to control their behavior because they're acting out in class. You don't ever get to abdicate that. At some point, they can't be screaming or running around the classroom. So now you're stuck medicating them. And I think what should be a last resort, which doesn't mean it's never necessary, but what should be as last resort is a first. And a young woman who I really admire, Freya India, who writes very well about Gen Z, she wrote a wonderful article, and her supposition is that so many young women today young people are identifying as asexual, not because they actually would be, but because they've been on SSRIs for so long. Now, that's just one of many examples of the way that getting in there and changing a child while they're still developing is a radical measure. And again, I'm not against everyone ever taking an antidepressant or a stimulant or any other things. There are various reasons that one might need it, even a child might need it, okay? The problem is that we're doing it without thought to the costs. And deleting a young person's sex drive is a big deal. Because actually, it's a fascinating story. When I interviewed Marcy Bowers for a piece for the Free Press, she told me she was a transgender surgeon. She told me this fascinating story. She's a transgender surgeon. She does gender surgeries, and she was she was working on patients who had suffered with female genital mutilation. And she was doing surgery, I guess, reparative work. And one of the things she told me was it turns out when you remove someone's sex drive, it doesn't just diminish their desire for sex. They have more trouble making intimate relationships. Because part of our drive to be close to people is sex drive. So when you get in there with a medication and totally alter a teen who's still developing, who could be going through a phase or could be going through a hard time, it's a radical thing to be doing. And again, I'm not saying never do it, but I think before you start down the road I haven't even gotten to stimulants. There's the literature on each of these things there are serious interventions. And before you go down that road, I think, you turn your life upside down to avoid it, if you can. And there are behavioral modifications that you can do to help with ADHD. There are other things you can do. You can remove tech, for instance, from a kid's life, especially little kids. That'll help with concentration. There are a lot of things you can do. But that's the idea.
I just saw Lenore Skenazy here, and I want to get back to play. Lenore is the founder of Let Grow, which is a great organization that is trying to bring back freedom, free play. Thank you. So if you're interested in more on that subject, look up Let Grow. Let's talk about the rise of social emotional learning. You document how this permeates our classrooms. It's not just something outside of the curriculum, it's being put into the curriculum. What is this? Do you know how this started? And once started, how did it spread all over the whole country? And tell us what a bones and no bones day is.
So I think it started about 15 years ago. And again, like a lot of things that aren't actually very good and have some harmful consequences, it started out, potentially with good intentions. Some people dispute that, by the way, but I generally try to give things the benefit of doubt, and a lot of people who bought into it, I think, had good intentions. And the idea is we're going to teach you how to emotionally regulate through a series of classes. But
this is for kids how old?
Well, it's a good question, but mostly elementary kids. They're very aggressive it's very invasive in elementary school. And by the way, a lot of parents don't even know their kids are going through this. They never send the textbooks home. They almost never send the textbooks home. But it's all over the country. I think I read recently it was 95% of public schools had it or something like that. Very, very high numbers have some social emotional learning. And the advocates are so impassioned about this. Many of the teachers will say, we should do social emotional learning in every class. Every class should be about emotional regulation. Every class should be about thinking about your feelings and sharing.
That's easier than math, right?
It's a lot easier than teaching algebra, yeah. Mm-hmm. And, they insist, and I interviewed sort of, people who are big advocates or run these programs, that social emotional learning is just going to help with skills like mindfulness, skills like, emotional regulation and self-awareness and that.
All the things you've told us we
want.
Should stop.
Right. Well, the practice is, it's funny. So they say that it's not group therapy. It's not group therapy. It looks a lot like group therapy because a lot of in order to talk about emotions, what do you have to do? Well, you give examples, right? You ask kids to share examples. Can you think of a time you were disappointed? Can you think of a time you were bullied? Can you think of a time you felt unheard or sad? Then they'll throw in, can you think of a time when you were really happy? Well, yeah, but that doesn't usually generate as much excitement and discussion. There's so much to say about this.
Tell us what bones and...
Yeah, the no bones and no bones. One teacher, I went to this 3-day teacher conference. So I started out writing a slightly different book. I started out thinking it had something to do with the way that these kids were in so much distress because they were being raised differently. There was something to do with their parenting, and I actually sold the book with that hypothesis. And then I attended this 3-day kids' mental health conference given by the California public school system, one of the largest in the country. And so I kind of wanted to know, what were the public schools doing to support kids' mental health? And I realized that therapy, far from being a somewhat minor phenomenon, confined to less than half kids, say, it was being crop dusted across an entire generation. And that kids were being asked about their feelings all the time. Kids were being told to share their pain all the time. Kids were talking about their trauma all the time. And it wasn't an accident that they were talking in these terms. It wasn't an accident that every kid talked about their social anxiety. That wasn't just some weird tick. That was the language of psychopathology they had picked up from mental health professionals, many of them in school. So that's when you asked about the no bones and bones day. So that was based on one of the teachers at the conference said that she begins every school day by asking kids this thing she picked up from a meme on YouTube, which is based on a pug and getting bones. And the question is it a bones day or a no bones day? Meaning, so do you think it's a good day today or a bad day? Well, why on earth would you be in class that way, right? I mean, I interviewed this absolutely brilliant and wonderful woman who's a professor of UC Irvine, Elizabeth Loftus, who was one of the greatest living psychologists. And it was just a delight to interview her. But one of the things she told me was that very often in group therapy sessions, and we know group therapy often comes with iatrogenic effects, like making people sadder, like making them more worried, like making them feel worse about the loss of a loved one. She said it's often like a little bit of memory, sort of memory poker goes on, or sadness, where you think about, oh, you just shared a memory that's sad. Well, if I say something minor, it's gonna bore everyone. So I'm gonna one-up that. And this is just a natural human response to sharing our pain, right? You don't wanna say something like, well, gosh, now I'm embarrassed to share mine because it was so minor. You naturally kind of one-up. And we were doing this with kids, effectively in school.
Where's your courage from? In our world today, to describe what really is, examine it, and present it, requires courage. In both your books, you've demonstrated that. Where do you get that, and how do you spread more of what you've got across the country?
That's so nice. First of all, thank you. I really appreciate that. I don't see myself that way, for whatever it's worth. I see myself with somewhat of a disagreeable, I guess they say, in the psychological behavior, personality types. I guess personality, meaning I don't tend to not consider people's feelings always and just sort of say. And so I think it sort of fit with my personality in every circumstance to just sort of say what I think and not always be thinking about what everyone's feelings are. But the reason I bring that up is something important. We used to remember that there was personality variation and that was actually good. Some kids were more inattentive. Some kids were more disagreeable. Some kids colored within the lines and did exactly what they were told. Some kids liked math. Some kids didn't. And that somehow we would all come together and create this amazing society because there were a lot of different kinds of jobs to do. And one of the things I learned just sort of personally was that my personality wasn't always great with all of my girlfriends, right? You don't always want to say everything that you're thinking. And there's no question I've hurt feelings before. But there was this role for me, it turned out, because there were areas in which it was good to tell the truth. And I think that's so good for our kids to know as well, that we don't have to diagnose and medicate everything. Because who knows why someone may come to love our kids, some spouse. Who knows what job might be perfect for them because of some quirk. And before we go in there and delete it with medication, it doesn't mean don't make them responsible, don't try to make them good people, don't treat them, teach them to be kind and good citizens. But before we go and delete what might just be a quirky part of their personality, maybe there's a use for it. Maybe they'll get some pleasure from it. Maybe the world needs it.
You describe, let's move to possible solutions. You describe one parenting style that you think could be helpful as an antidote to this gentle parenting, and you call it dad-style parenting. And you make the point you do not have to be a dad to do dad-style parenting.
That's right.
Which you summarize it as knock it off and shake it off. Talk more about that, and if you're old enough, that style of parenting sounds very familiar to you. So where'd it go, and should we bring it back?
I think we should absolutely bring it back, and here's why. It's not that everyone needs to say it to a kid in every instance. Of course, we all remember times when we were in serious pain, but someone we tried to tell about it didn't pay attention or didn't listen. Those are the things that sort of stick with us and make us probably overcorrect, right? I mean, as someone who has accidentally sent kids of hers to school while they had a fever, we've all done these things where we didn't realize that a kid was actually sick this time or, actually injured. Gosh, I didn't know it was broken. I didn't, that kind of thing. But here's the thing. The problem today is not that not everybody says it. It's that no one says it. No one ever says to a kid, you'll live, go back and play. They need to hear it from somebody, right? They need to know, because they will throw, and I learned this in the last book, they will throw all their worries at their parents, sometimes just to see if they're real, if they're important. And girls who are bringing to their therapist and their mom, I think I have gender dysphoria. Some of them just needed to hear, no, you don't. Okay? You're 12. You're not a pansexual. For a lot of them, that actually did a lot of good. Right? Some of these girls were just testing stuff out, and kids do this all the time. And it's funny, I was at a soccer game recently with my son one of my sons plays soccer, and he was with this really tough team. And one of the boys, very athletic kid on the other team, got really knocked down. And he was an African-American kid, and his dad was standing next to me, and I heard him mutter, he's fine, get up. And the boy did. And he was fine. And I just thought, gosh, I haven't heard that in a long time. Just that faith that you can keep going. They need our faith that they can keep going, kids, because they don't know it. They don't know it. They start out thinking every scratch is a major deal, right? And when we minimize the more serious things that we're going through, that, dad just lost his job, or, things to actually worry about because we want to take every pain of theirs super duper seriously, sometimes we magnify the monster under the bed. And that's what I'm worried about. It's not the kids who are anorexic and desperately need help. Of course, we know what to do with them, right? We know that a child needs treatment when they are seriously ill. The question is, what do you do for all the scratches? Because they're going to get a lot of them, and all the broken arms. And it's not trauma. And we shouldn't be telling them that it is.
So you're in the trenches. You have 3 young kids who are going through school systems where presumably this is happening. What do you do? But what can a parent do? And can individual parents do it alone? I mean, there is almost some risk at being the obstructive parent against what everyone else is being taught. Do parents have to organize?
Parents need to do all kinds of things, but this is the issue I'm most optimistic about. We can fix this. We can fix out the over-medication of bummed out kids, the over-psychopathologizing of bummed out, worried kids. That we can fix. Here's what we need to do, and this is a pervasive problem. I saw it with the last book too. We are not teaching our kids what we believe. Those house signs, in this house we believe, and they're very showy and very silly, but we aren't telling our kids what we believe in this house. I would tell parents all the time, does your daughter know your views on gender ideology? Well, I don't want to get into it with her. Well, her teacher does. Her school counselor does. Why don't you tell her what you believe? And that's true of therapy too, which is don't tell a kid that I'm not saying tell a kid you can never go to therapy or that it's a bad or weak thing to do. I would never say that. But what I'm saying is that you can tell a kid, you're going to be fine. There's nothing wrong with you. Because most of the time there isn't. There's a huge variation in humanity. And it's amazing. It really should be embraced, especially by their parents. Because we know that little bit of weirdness, is what their grandfather had too. And he did some great things. And it might have been annoying to people at some times that he was curt or whatever the problem may have been, but it also might have helped that he was so stubborn, right? It's not all going to be roses. We know that. That's the story of human survival and thriving. It's not all easy. That's okay. We don't need to rush ahead and make it easy. We need to tell them, this is what your grandfather went through, your grandfather. And that's the proof that you can get through it too.
Are you doing different things with your kids from most of their friends? I mean, do your kids have phones? Do they have unlimited internet? access? Are they on teams, or are they out building forts in the backyard? What?
So my kids don't have phones. They're 13, and 11. They don't have phones. But I will say that the tech issue is a big one. It's hard because everybody's connected. And, the effort to get phones out of schools at a minimum during the school day is so important and such a no-brainer. It's almost embarrassing we haven't done it sooner. It absolutely needs to happen. I'm behind this, 100%. I think there are wonderful people out there fighting, like Jonathan Haidt. I just think it's fantastic, and I really, really hope he's successful. So at least cabinet during the school day. But the phones are hard. I think that, you asked what was I doing?
How do your kids, everyone's on a phone. How do your kids know where to go? What's happening?
So, there are enough phones out there that if they need a phone, they can borrow one. That's how many there are. And eventually, if we get them a phone, we haven't decided, they're going to go to high school next year, so I have to make a decision what to do about that. If we get them a phone, it'll either be some kind of flip phone, or it'll be what they call a kosher phone. These things actually exist. But it limits all the apps and whatever. You have sort of basic apps like WhatsApp if they absolutely need to communicate for school. I'm not sure about it. But I want to say something. This is so important. If you raise your kids right, which means give them a responsibility, give them high expectations, tell them your values, not my values, your values, you can trust them more easily with all kinds of things. And I think we can let go of some of our neurosis if we actually make our kids stronger. See, we spent a generation obsessing over their happiness, and we did almost nothing. We never thought about, but will this make my kids stronger? That's the question. It's not never give them an academic accommodation or on-time tests. It's, do they really need it? Will it make them stronger? Are they just a little bit not so great at math? How significant is this? Because I talked to parents. One woman I talked to, I call her Angela in the book, but she said the worst thing she ever did was get her son an academic accommodation at school so he could get out of taking timed math tests. She said, looking back, he was a little slow to finish. He often had 1 or 2 leftover math problems. But as soon as he got that accommodation, he used that as an excuse for everything. He stopped trying. She felt it sabotaged his academic career and what he could have done. That's the question to ask. Does he really need it? And I think, and here's the most important thing, the parent is in the best position to know the answer. Because they know what they needed. They know what their parents needed. They have some sense, having raised the kid, of knowing what their kid needs. Better than someone who just saw them for a half-hour session or just met them at the start of 7th grade and really just wants this kid to stop asking questions.
You tell the story in the book. You talk about how there are milestones for kids, maturity and independence, and we're crushing those. It's really no big deal if your 16-year-old goes to the grocery store in the neighborhood and picks up some groceries. But it's kind of a big deal if your 9-year-old does. Like your 9-year-old. Tell about that.
So one of the things, you talked before about courage, and I think of myself as having fear, but I have slightly different fear. So it's not that I'm afraid of lots of things, including something happening to my kids, right? I'm not afraid of telling the truth for whatever reason. I'm afraid of a world in which lies prevail. I'm more afraid of that. And when it comes to sending my kids to the store, which I do, one of the things I learned from talking to many, many parents, and I conducted over 200 interviews for the book, was that if you don't suck it up and let your kids do things they are capable of doing, they stop wanting to leave the cage. I kept talking to parents who didn't let their 9-year-old explore the neighborhood, and then when they were 13, she couldn't get him out of the house. I'm more afraid of that. And I hate it when my kids leave the house. It's not that I'm so brave. It's that I feel like I can't just communicate my anxiety to them. Because we know that anxiety is really contagious, and very often the best way to treat a kid with anxiety is by treating the parents. because the parents are actually the source. So I kind of have to be brave for them because they will be stronger in the world if they know what they can handle. If they feel like they are not terrified because you were late to pick them up, because they have a sense of like, I got this. I know how to ask for help. I can talk to a stranger. I know approximately where my house is and how to get there. They'll be so much stronger if they can do those things.
That is a great point to turn it to the audience for questions. And we have people with microphones, so please ask your question into the mic. And over here.
Hi. So it's a statement and a question. I have an 8-year-old. She's in 3rd grade. I'm very much into this social emotional learning minefield. So a little anecdote. Last week we were on holiday break, and my daughter just loves unstructured play, and she was like, Mommy, I want to play school. And so she took an hour to set up her lesson plan. And so I go in and she said, okay, now we're going to start the day where we're going to talk about our feelings. So, I mean, this so resonates. And, she's in 3rd grade, 1st and 2nd grade. It was like naming your emotions. It's called The Ruler, which is this new curriculum that's been rolled out with a lot of fanfare. And what they do is they plot their emotions on what is like a color board. And so she said, Mommy, how are you feeling today? And I said, time out. Like, is this what you really do? And she said, oh yeah, this is, well, are you red for angry? Are you green? I'm like, who came up with these colors? Right. So they're expecting children. I mean, these are really like, it seems almost arbitrary concepts. Anyway, so it's very real. But I want to take this a step further. Now what they're going through is kindness weeks. Right. So have you seen this in your research? Now it's like not only social emotional learning, but it's like being kind to the nth degree. And that's what really worries me, especially having a girl, like kindness above all. So.
Yeah, 2 things about kindness. So first of all, was so interesting. I love the comment. It's totally right. It's one of the interesting things about kindness, the way they push it now in schools is because the thrust is all therapeutic. They actually explain it in terms of mental health. Be kind because kind people are happier, they tell kids. That's not why you need to be kind, right? And no one should tell a kid that. First of all, you're lying to them. I'm not sure that's true. I hear that sociopaths enjoy their trade. I don't know. But also, more importantly, that's not why you're kind. You're kind because it's the right thing to treat a person kindly, right? These are virtues. But there's something else, too, I learned when I was researching. There's a wonderful book by Paul Bloom, Against Empathy. And this book he's an academic psychologist. It's an amazing book. But he says that empathy, he's an empathy researcher, and he says that it's actually not possible to empathize with more than 2 people at the same time, more than 2, conflicting or 2 people at the same time. So it actually psychologically has a narrow aperture. And you're more likely to preference the people right in front of you and their pain. And it often coincides with cruelty to the ones outside your ambit. It actually goes along. See, if fairness and justice are your guide, you may treat everyone fairly. But if empathy is your guide, you're very likely to preference the people in front of you and show greater cruelty to those outside your ambit. I don't think there's a better example of this in society today than letting biological boys into girls' sports. We show empathy for the transgender identified boy, and who cares how he completely wrecks all of girls' achievements, their records, maybe even jeopardizing their fitness and safety, because we're seeing girls get injured. That's empathy. Anyway. Yeah.
The gentleman over there.
When you've done...
Hold the microphone up.
Sorry. In doing your study, have you found that there is a link between, or an inverse link between the number of children in a household and the prevalence of the phenomena you're describing?
So which phenomenon?
The whole therapeutic approach to child raising.
So there's a few. So there's a few studies that sort of touch on this that I could talk about, but I would just say that having more kids seems to be really good for kids. Turns out siblings are a really good way to shock test other kids, right? You're not going to be crushed the moment someone teases you and call it bullying. If you have a bunch of siblings who regularly call you stupid and you see you're fine. And one of the problems is not only that we stopped having more kids, not only that we let them be around cousins, grandparents, people who love them. This is so important, relational stability. We don't give them this. People who love you and love you back over a lifetime is a huge part of human happiness. That's the Harvard Grant study showed that. That's a huge part of it, okay? Not people moms hired to watch you. People who really love you. So I think surrounding you, having you go through the beta testing and toughening of siblings, there's no doubt that that's important. There's another thing too. I think Jean Twenge did this research where during the pandemic, it turned out that college co-eds who were sent home, the ones who went back to larger families, even if they really didn't want to be there, because they really wanted to be back in college, they ended up happier than the kids who were isolated. And it didn't matter that they didn't want to be back in mom's house and in her kitchen and under her rules. They still ended up with much better mental health.
In the green?
Thank you so much. So interesting. My question is that now, not only are all kids in therapy, but all adults are in therapy too. And in every corporate environment, we also have all these social, emotional, rules that we have to follow. What is that doing to us as adults, all the people in this room?
Okay, so, I write about kids for a reason because I'm interested, but also because I tend to think that adults in a free society can be trusted to know what's right for them. So just my big prejudice is if you think that you want to be in therapy, or if you think you need therapy, maybe you do. But are there iatrogenic effects of therapy? No question. There's a great deal of research on this, as I said. And here are a few classic things that can happen in therapy. People can be made more anxious. People can be made more depressed, rehashing a worry or a fear, or having to even produce one weekly. Oh gosh, I'm meeting with my therapist. I have to come up with something that I was upset about this week, right? I mean, we've all done it, right? Shit, what am I going to talk about today? It's like you produce the story that you might have just let go, right? But also it can undermine relationships with spouses, with parents. The rising generation has more parental alienation, meaning young people cutting off their parents, than we've ever seen. And the therapists are no doubt playing a role. I interviewed a psychologist who's an expert who deals with alienation. And he said to me, it was a great quote, Joshua Coleman, is a brilliant, wonderful guy. And he gave me a great quote at the beginning of the book. And he said, if I had to tell parents one thing, the thing that's going to make them angriest is you, or the biggest risk, and I'm paraphrasing, is the therapist they're going to see at some point. So we know that therapy can do all these things, right? Oh, the other thing it can do, and this is also what we're seeing in the rising generation, it can make you feel like you can't handle your life. The habit of having checking in with a therapist weekly can make you second guess that you can make a decision and do things on your own without checking in, without asking permission, without strategizing. And it can do this to adults, but what is scary is I interviewed so many kids. You're seeing this across this generation, this incapacity, this lack of efficacy, which is a side effect of therapy. But I interviewed one woman who I thought really nailed it. Becca, I call her Becca in the book. She was a high school senior. She'd been in therapy since she was 6 because her parents divorced, so they immediately put her in therapy. It wasn't like she had necessarily a problem per se, or not a mental health problem, but her parents divorced and they were told that's what you do. She stayed in therapy until she was 17. And I asked her, well, are you on any medication? No. She said she has trouble with anxiety. Okay. What are you working on now with your therapist? She said, oh, well, I'm going to college. I just got into college. So I'm working with my therapist on making friends. I want to do a good job making friends in college. So we're sort of strategizing. This is what we're seeing. They don't know they can make friends without the therapist. They're afraid to try. They don't know what they can do because we've let people be experts to them on all sorts of things that teenagers used to just trust themselves to try at. And you want to know why we're not seeing, in my view, tech CEO founders in this generation? Because in the millennials, we saw tons of them, right? Facebook, Snapchat, Spotify. So where are the Gen Z tech founders? These kids are afraid to try. They're afraid to go out on their own because they've always been told, before you do that, you could get hurt. Check in with this expert. Check in with an adult. Check in with mom. Yes.
Thank you for writing this book and this great conversation. I want to go back to something Emily, you asked Abigail about how she is maybe parenting differently than people around her. And Abigail, you talked about the values that you have that you want to instill into your children. Right now, my values are in direct conflict with the values of the school my kids go to, the other parents. So I have to say to my kids, here's what I believe, but other people don't believe that. And then we have to sort of strategize about how we hide or share our belief systems. So I'm wondering if you can talk about that, because that is a really weird thing to communicate to my kids, even, that essentially we live in a kind of left-wing Stasi, New York public school situation.
So here's what I would say to you. Your kid is going to face a lot of people who are not afraid to communicate what they think is right to your kids. So before you send them out there, it isn't, well, other people, we think this, but other people feel differently. It's, and this is right. Because I'm your mom, and I know what's right, and this is right. I don't know what's right for everyone. I know what's right for you, because I'm your mom. Remember when we used to say that to kids? And they marched off, and for a period they believed it, and then they decided we were wrong about everything, because kids do. But in the back of their heads, they still had that voice. And it sometimes stopped them from doing a lot of bad things. Even though they really were mad at mom, sometimes if we buried that in their heads, they wouldn't try drugs, even though they really wanted to, because they couldn't get that voice out saying, I'm going to kill you if you do that, right? I think the ability to tell our kids right from wrong before they hear the opposite, the inversion, is so important about all kinds of things. What we think about free speech. They shouldn't not know that it's an important thing as an American to cherish free speech. And yet we send them off assuming they'll kind of get that value in college, but they're getting the opposite because they're going in and being proselytized too. And I think this should be true of all kinds of things we think are good and right for them. Yes, some of them they will reject. Some of them will get wrong. It's okay. We'll get some things wrong about what we think is right for them. That's okay, too. Because, and this is very old research going back to the 1960s, kids need the structure. They need the rules. And unfortunately, and I talked to many, interesting people who told me this, including experts in things like radical movements. When they don't get the moral clarity at home, sometimes they go looking for it from radical sources.
That's a great place to end because our time's up. So thank you for the question. Lisa.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in, and we hope you enjoyed the conversation. If you did like what you heard on the podcast, please consider giving us 5 stars and writing a review on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, or wherever you listen. And be sure to check out future episodes of Manhattan Insights.